The idea for this panel is to provide very brief presentations, first of all, from our panelists, and then engage in a very informal, very lightweight discussion. Since it's like the end of the day, some of you are probably tired, but we really want to provide some entertainment for you until 6:30 to discuss this very controversial theme, which is the roadmap for internet governance ecosystem.
So we've been asked to talk about the roadmap. So I'm sure you're all aware that NETmundial has two primary outcomes. One is a set of general principles. The second is a roadmap. Now, one general comment I think is in order. A roadmap implies that you know where you're going. It's a map to somewhere. Principles, I think you could say, could be construed as the general direction, but the roadmap is how you actually get to where you want to go. Effectively, it's an operationalization of those general principles. Now, it's easier to get consensus around the general principles. It's much harder to get consensus or to build consensus around the specifics. We have an English colloquialism that is, we say the devil is in the details. And what I mean by that is it's hard to get to the specifics. And it's particularly difficult in the internet governance ecosystem, if you will, because there's a series of difficult trade-offs that need to be made. There's also a range of different stakeholders, all of whom have a multiplicity of interests. And I really liked the point made in different ways by Mr. Cerf and by Bertrand on the preceding panel, which is to say that internet governance takes place in a range of different levels. There's the architecture, there's the substance, there's a host of actors in each of these areas, many of whom have conflicting interests at points. So we need to, when we're talking about the specifics and we're talking about the evolution of the roadmap and how we get to where we want to go, we need to be prepared to make difficult choices and counterbalance trade-offs. And rather than just talk about it in kind of really general ways, let's take one specific concrete example. And this is the one that's been rolling around. It was rolling around this morning and it was talked about this afternoon: privacy. Privacy is an issue. So let's think about the principle. The principle is people should have a right to privacy online, or even people have a right to privacy online. That's the principle. So let's try and operationalize it. Let's think through the implications of trying to realize just what that principle actually means when we're getting into the details. So let's leave aside for a moment privacy and private companies. That's done usually in private contract, terms of service arrangements. So when you go to a service and you scroll through that 8-page document that no one actually reads, that's what will typically govern your rights to privacy in that contractual private arrangement. What's much more interesting for our purposes is states and citizens. And when I'm talking about states and citizens, I'm talking about intelligence collection and the NSA and the Snowden leaks. So I think three general comments are in order while we're talking about how we actually move or advance the debate. Number one, there's a changing role for intelligence agencies. Number two, the nature of rights. We need to have a detailed discussion about what rights actually mean online, what human rights, what the content of those rights are, and we need to talk about the trade-offs. So the changing role of intelligence. It used to be spy versus spy. Country A would send spies into country B, they would collect information and they would come back. And country B would try and run counterintelligence operations to stop them from spying. That was the way that it was always done, and that was the way countries behaved. What's new, this is the first time that the global public, individuals in this room, have been seen as a source of intelligence. The technology's made that possible. So now we can have large-scale, massive global intercepts, and I realize that we're starting to advance in terms of necessary and proportional, but again, these are very, very general concepts. The devil is in the details, but this is a nuanced change. This has never been the case before. The global public has never been seen as a source of intelligence. It's been governments and it's been companies that have been spied on, not individuals. This is different. Now we need to talk about the nature of rights themselves. Usually, when you think of rights, it's something that you claim against the state. And in most instances, it's a right that you claim against your own government. And they're typically limited in certain respects, and it's important. So let's talk about the ICCPR, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. If you look at that document, what it actually says is that there's a series of rights that individuals have, and countries are obliged to grant those rights within its territory or in areas under its jurisdiction. And I know Bertrand did a tremendous job laying out some of the comments on jurisdiction, so I won't go over it again. But suffice it to say, that's a nuance that we need to tackle, because if a country is spying or they're doing massive data intercepts in a foreign territory, it's hard to say how that would qualify if you look at the limiting language in the ICCPR. So we need to have a more detailed discussion about the extension of human rights online, because if you buy or you believe the principle that there should be a right to privacy online, we need to talk in specific ways about where that right actually comes from. Because it doesn't come from thin air. We need to talk about where the right comes from, what the contours of that right actually are. Now we need to talk trade-offs. Because make no mistake, the reason that the NSA was out there doing these intercepts was for threat-related intelligence. There's bad people in the world that want to do bad things, and the job of intelligence apparatuses is to stop them from doing that. So let's get to specifics. Earlier today, there was a good conversation amongst several folks from Brazil and several folks from Germany. So let's use those as examples. Angela Merkel. It was revealed that the NSA was tapping her personal cell phone. She was deeply offended. The global community catalyzed around that, and the response was universal condemnation from countries across the board. Ditto, Dilma Rousseff in the General Assembly, she made some pretty stark comments that many people agreed with about the nature of the NSA's surveillance operations. So we can see that there's probably a norm that's forming there. You're not allowed to surreptitiously intercept the personal communications of world leaders, and the Americans even came out and recognized this. On the other side, it'd probably be a difficult sell to say that two Al-Qaeda operatives have a reasonable expectation of privacy while they're scheming a terrorist bombing incident. So over here, world leaders, personal cell phones, that's clearly offside. Probably we could say that there's a norm forming there. Over here, bad people doing bad things, Al-Qaeda operatives, chances are there's no expectation of privacy. The difficulty, of course, is that there's a massive gray area in the middle there. And that's where we need to have a detailed, nuanced, and intelligent discussion about what the trade-offs are going to be and who's going to trade what. Because make no mistake, it's our privacy, it's your privacy, it's my privacy, it's the global privacy that's at stake of individuals. But at the same time, we need to recognize that states have a legitimate interest, and I realize that that word's been thrown around a little bit, but states have a legitimate interest in protecting their citizens. And in fact, that's the reason that we have states, is to protect us from threats both foreign and domestic. So we need to talk about the legitimate interest that we all have in privacy online and the human rights elements of that. But we need to talk about the legitimate interests of states. Now, again, I want to come back to something that was said in the earlier panel. We need to build frameworks. I think that's a tremendous idea. We need to advance this discussion. The problem is that there's not even a good place to have this discussion, because intelligence agencies don't operate in the light. They operate in the shadows, and they're very, very uncomfortable in having a public discourse on this. But if we actually want to talk from taking general principles into operationalizing them and talking about the hard trade-offs and the difficult decisions that need to be made in this space, we need to have a framework. And in order to advance that framework, we need to have a discussion. And in order to do that, we need to find a place to have that chat. So those would be my initial comments, subject to any questions.
I want to look at this issue from a slightly different point of view, rather than picking a specific issue, maybe mention 2 or 3 at the end. But I want to first of all say that 2.1 billion people are connected, and out of a total population of a global population of 7 billion. That means it's only 30% that are connected. So the majority of the people in the world are not connected. So let's also know that as we discuss this whole issue of internet governance, even if everybody connected took a position and voted, you're still the minority. Yet the internet affects all 7 billion people of the world. So I think what we may want to do going forward is, rather than the history that has been there in terms of when issues come to the surface, then we start dealing with them and they become prioritized. I think we probably need to think of a framework of internet governance, how we'll be dealing with issues. We don't want an issue prioritization because of the urgency. Like now I'm seeing even, I think ITF, they're having something on privacy. Some while ago, they said privacy is nothing you can ever have. Now I'm seeing some list trying to have an effort because it's an issue, because of issues that we have all discussed. So I think the kind of roadmap we should have is, let's have a very honest and candid discussion. We have had very good experiences with the models that have been there, what has worked with them, what has not worked. So we have a genuine conversation and discuss the faults because we want to think of how to solve those problems. But if we don't address them when we are only at 30%, the problem is going to get worse when we get up to 50% of the people. And then what could happen is, if it's bottled so much, it will probably bring fundamentalism. And we don't want that. We want to solve the problem ahead. And we don't want to wait for other leaders to be spied on, so that the spying becomes the next issue we'll all meet next time when there's an issue of that sort. So let's have a laundry list of the issues based on all experiences we have had in the different fora of internet governance, without exclusion or without trying to prioritize. NETmundial is one of them. We have all of that, IGF, every place at national, we have a pool of all the issues that are there. Let's get the different perspectives of an issue, because the issues are known really. We could have different views, but the issues are known. Let's also accept contrarian views. Let's not try to use a bulldozed multi-stakeholderism, which is not democratic, to suppress some issues because the rough consensus or majority or whatever of the people that are there decided on behalf of everybody else. Now, let's also ensure that participation is assured. That the question I had asked earlier was, indeed, it's interesting if you actually think about it, that if you don't have in the internet governance ecosystem or model that you have, mechanisms of ensuring that there is at least equitable, some sort of equitable participation, sustainable, then I'm sorry, you are creating a structural, or will be creating a structural exclusion, which will manifest itself in very many ways. And just to give an example, nuance or a perspective to this, is let's consider something like what they call the registrar accreditation. The information, ICANN may have a working group to decide on what information needs to be collected from the registrar and people who own a domain name. The people that sit there, who could probably be, not probably, they are the ones who run the registries, yeah? They are the ones who actually do register that. If they meet and decide, it's like marking their own homework, and they may decide it's easier, to just give out all our information, do away with anonymity. And all the people that are doing the work that they are doing, they could start off from soft spying, they could go on to the harder spying, social spying, to the massive intelligence gathering, and it could endanger activists, and we all know the risks that are involved with this. So if you didn't have, or a mechanism of ensuring that people participate, then there will be a problem. Now, the question then would be, how do you ensure that? And I use the same model of government. Government doesn't have to ask everybody in their population, what is their view on something. But certainly government taxes everybody to provide the common interest or common good services, so that you can have your own private army, your own road, but it has to tax. So there must be a governance mechanism that actually equitable. It's an equitable fund that actually does that on a sustainable basis. Not that somebody must beg because they are unable, they don't have a business model of participation. So that's an issue we must deal with. Now, the other thing is we must also be prepared or start contemplating what are the solutions we are proposing, their disruptiveness. What are they going to mean to disrupting the current status quo of whatever it is? Because certain businesses will be upset. They will not want that. They have grown big. We'll also find there a certain order that has been established. And so there is going to be disruptiveness proposed by the new solutions or the framework that we are coming up with. How do we deal with that? Power relations, they'll be disrupted. There will also be political repercussions. We have also seen them with IANA and everything. So there are many other issues. Of course, that's just one example. And again, the framework that we must propose as a solution must be based on internationally acceptable legal frameworks or principles. Therefore, we can't have, let's say the example I just gave a short while ago. If you are passing those, that policy that determines how much information you are collecting on people, by the few individuals based on a certain maybe majority, one country, and then it's applied to all the people around the world, incidentally, we have created an international jurisdiction problem where one country's laws are now exercised throughout the rest of the world. So we must find a way where everything is done is anchored on internationally acceptable principles of law, at least so that all the countries connected feel they're on the same platform. The issues then, other issues that must be addressed are one of the biggest problems developing countries have, which is the complete opposite of what happens in other businesses, where you find developing countries subsidize developed countries' internet costs. This is a major issue, in addition to actually re-importing their traffic because of the infrastructural construction. I'm not saying that maybe it's something that could be done, or maybe it's because of somebody else, but because most of the traffic usually comes out. But there are issues that have to do with costs and who is subsidizing who in terms of cost. There must be a way of addressing it. If you leave it to business or so-called private sector to keep handling that, then these issues will keep being a burden to the ones who are already overburdened. So there will be issues. There was also the issue maybe we might want to address that has to do with the evolution of that model. How are we going to have that framework such that it is reviewable? And then lastly, the principle I would want to have on that sort of framework is transparency. It should not, and accountability. It should not be a framework that releases information as they wish, or at least they are not having a framework, or whoever is actually making a decision, there's lack of accountability. If that a lack of accountability doesn't exist, then there are going to be challenges going forward, and you can only expect maybe another crisis to happen, and we'll meet. But if we address the issues in a sort of a framework way, that way we stand probably a better chance of having a more sustained approach to resolving various complex issues. I dare say I'm not naive to the simplicity of the issues, but the framework may guide us on how to go forward. So I'll stop there, and thank you for listening.
When we talk about the notion of a roadmap for the future evolution of internet governance, or the internet governance ecosystem, etc., we're presuming, I think, an ability to view the landscape of internet governance in the same way you might look at the landscape of any other international policy area and describe the range of institutional frameworks and the effectiveness with which they sync with each other, the gaps that might exist between them, ways in which particular institutions could be improved and enhanced, all that kind of thing. And that's what the document originally was intending to sort of take on, that kind of a challenge. And it's a lot to try to work out, obviously, in a multi-stakeholder process under a lot of pressure with very difficult constraints. But I think if you look at the NETmundial document, the section on the evolution of internet governance, they do put forward some ideas that are quite useful. And I thought what I would do is to try to facilitate conversation here is just talk about a couple of them, four in particular, briefly, just to frame this question of improvements to the architecture and the arrangements that we have. So there is a second section. I assume everybody's looked at the document. There's a second section on issues dealing with institutional improvements. And I want to direct myself to four things, as I say. First is the paragraph 16 consideration should be given to the possible need for mechanisms, it's actually kind of wordy, to address emerging topics and issues that are not currently being adequately addressed by existing governance arrangements. So there's a notion there that there may be gaps in the system, there may be issues that arise where there's no institutional home. We sometimes have referred to these over the past decade as issues that have been orphaned or are complex, multidimensional, and simply don't fit within any of the jurisdictional boxes of the existing institutions. There's also further language, which actually the drafting seems to have gotten a little bit conflating here, between the notion of creating new mechanisms that could help to fill these spaces and the notion of coordination, which is actually a bit different. But there is language that says that it would be recommendable to analyze the option of creating internet governance coordination tools to perform ongoing monitoring, analysis, and information sharing functions. That's the dimension I want to speak to. This notion of ongoing information sharing, aggregation, and so on is something that's been kicking around for quite some time. That The idea being that irrespective of any demands to create new spaces to actually negotiate policy outcomes at the global level and so on, one of the things that we're missing in the institutional architecture is sort of a knowledge bank type function, a intellectual clearinghouse type function that would help governments when they're dealing with difficult policy problems that don't have any clear institutional home in the global arrangements, or maybe they don't have national level policy frameworks that they can really draw on as examples, where they would be able to go and gather information that's been aggregated, surfaced, brought together by the international community. So in other words, this would be something that would help governments when they're tackling problems like spam or interconnection charges or whatever it might be, where there's no bounded fixed set of institutional arrangements. They would be able to go and try to connect with the relevant sources of information, expertise, people active in the field, get some sense of the topography of where are things being done, where are things not being done, who can they talk to, and effectively start to build a policy network to help them address the problem. So this, as I say, this is something that some of us have been talking about off and on for some time under various types of rubrics, various types of labels. And I think now it's an issue that's starting to come back again because as we've gone through all of these difficult negotiations over the past decade, it started to become more obvious that there is this kind of knowledge sharing, information sharing gap. There's a number of people who are expressing interest then in trying to do something about that within different international institutions, as well as the private sector, technical community, and civil society. And we've seen proposals put forward by the European Commission and by other actors to construct new processes that would help to serve this function. So that language is included in the document, and I think it's an interesting thing that that's there. It hasn't been included in any kind of clear way thus far in any other previously discussed international level texts. So this perhaps is a opportunity to begin to frame that question a little bit more clearly and try and specify, is there indeed a function there that could be usefully performed? And if so, what would we do, what would we build to address it? Would you create some sort of a multi-stakeholder entity that has MOUs with governments in order to have some grounding in the governmental frameworks? Would you do something else? There are a lot of questions there that have to be addressed, and people are starting to think about that. So that's the document. That I think is interesting. The second thing that's in the document in this section on institutional improvements is the notion of strengthening the IGF. Everybody on this panel has been very much involved, and people in the audience have been involved in the debate about this since the inception of the IGF, and indeed some of us from before the IGF was created. And the notion that indeed we want something more than just an annual conference, that the IGF could be a platform, an integrative, holistically mandated platform, where you could form working groups to address different types of problems and have people working on an intersessional basis and perhaps put forward recommendations of their own or some kind of outcomes, etc. This is, I think, an important thing. It was resisted for a very long time. There were a lot of parties who said, no, we don't want the IGF to evolve like that. This is dangerous. It could turn into a negotiating thing, etc. But I think now people are starting to understand that the gap is there, that the absence of something like that in the international system is presenting problems. And I think that there's now a more adult conversation happening about intersessional work, about outcomes-oriented work and so on, and Internet Society and other players have been contributing to that discussion a lot. So I think that that's really good that this language is in there and that we're reinforcing the IGF role. A third thing that's in the document in this section that's important, I think, is the notion that we need to develop multi-stakeholder mechanisms at the national level. Clearly, Brazil and some other countries have devised frameworks for bringing together parties, trying to aggregate interests and feed into policy, if not shape policy outcomes and so on. But in many countries around the world, such things do not exist. And in consequence, of course, very often you have delegations flying into Brazil to talk to CGI-BR about how do you do these things and so on. And the question becomes, well, In fact, a lot of the issues that we deal with in internet governance really do have a very strong national level component. Would it be possible to have some sort of a shared mechanism for helping provide model examples, for example, of multi-stakeholder systems, how to organize them at the national level? And again, this might feed into some sort of a knowledge bank type function. So this is flagged also in the document. That's, I think, interesting, and again, something maybe we can build on. Last point, IANA transition. Somebody has to say it. Carlos told me I should say it. So, okay, we know the United States government in March announced its intention to withdraw from its historic role vis-a-vis the IANA functions, subject, of course, to the multi-stakeholder community being able to devise an effective framework that maintains the security and stability of the internet, brings together all the parties, and basically gets the consensus of everybody involved, more or less. ICANN has put forward now a scoping document laying out a vision for how they might go about structuring the discussion about how to do this transition. As you know, there's a lot of political pressure within the United States around this issue. We've had this kind of interesting dynamic where Sarah Palin and various other luminaries from the far right have suddenly discovered the IANA functions and have decided that having protocol parameters become handled by ICANN could be problematic, and so there's pushback on that. So it's becoming a very complex and interesting political space. It is very interesting, though, to see that finally, after a decade of this discussion throughout the WSIS and so on about oversight in IANA and the need to get the U.S. out of this role, you have the U.S. government actually saying, we're prepared to do this if the multi-stakeholder community can devise effective frameworks that bring together all the parties and don't break anything. So you've got text in the document endorsing that trajectory and encouraging that the process be concluded by September 2015 when the current contract ends. Those are just 4 points then. This notion of a clearinghouse or some kind of knowledge bank type thing that could be used to help governments support develop policy approaches, the notion of strengthening the IGF, the notion of replicating multi-stakeholder frameworks at the national level, and the IANA functions transition. These are 4, I think, very interesting and promising elements that the drafting team managed to put into the document, in which I hope the community of people that are involved will be able to come together around and endorse, and that we can use then going forward in a normative way to encourage developments down those trajectories in the future. And I'll stop there.
No, thank you all. It's great to follow on 3 people who took different angles to this, and then I'll take a 4th, but I'll try to combine elements of this to bring it a little bit more together. Bill flagged some very good directions the roadmap is going in, which was helpful. Aaron emphasized, I think, some of the tough issues and specific considerations that are going to have to be resolved to get this to sort of the last stage on the road. I'll try to avoid abusing that metaphor, but it's just very tempting. And I think Alex sort of flagged perhaps the biggest substantive problem that we're going to face, the tightest turn or the toughest grade in the road, which is non-inclusive processes, having decisions that are made that affect a large portion of the internet community and the internet itself by a very few people in something that is normatively and arguably morally wrong. And I think these are all really important considerations. I'm going to go in a different direction, though, and I'm going to go a little bit more abstract. So the way that I'm thinking of the roadmap as it is in the outcome document now, I'm sort of thinking of it as a first step and then a bunch of middle steps. And so what I think I'm going to try to do is fill out what I see the second step as being and what the last step as being. So the first step, I think, is actually the IANA transition. I wasn't planning to mention it again, but realized it fit in well. I mean, I think this roadmap really has identified a first concrete step that we can work towards to get to an internet governance framework at the end of the day that meets the different goals and criteria that we all would like to see that have. So then what's next is the question, right? And so I was thinking about this, and I mean, we've got a lot of different specific things that we keep in mind. The surveillance example is and privacy is a great example of that. And we don't know what to do with things like this, right? So the roadmap starts to talk about some of these. It gives a few specific issues, and it gives some factors that need to be kept in mind as we develop new structures around internet governance. So sort of like a left turn and a right turn as you're on steps 9 or 10 of the Google Maps directions. But it's a little bit hard to contextualize all that because we still don't have turns sort of 2 through 4, I think, or at least that's what has been bugging me so much. So the other half of that, in addition to just having trouble seeing the whole roadmap as it stands now, is it's really easy to get bogged down in the things that Aaron and Alex are talking about. It's all too likely that we're going to spend the next 2 days talking about human rights and the extent to which what we come out of this with is going to address and resolve that. And I'm glad that we're talking about human rights. It's important to talk about human rights. But if we spend all of our time talking about human rights, I don't know that we're going to make tractable progress. So in the way that I've been thinking about this, and in what you'll see if you read the Mozilla submission to NETmundial, you'll see something which I think is consciously a bit more abstract and doesn't try to engage with this stuff, to try to help build some more steps along the way. So the submission that we put in tried to articulate and understand and encourage other people to view internet governance as it works in practice as sort of a temporal arc that starts with issue framing. We think about an issue that we want to have an internet governance system address. And then we raise that and we start talking to other people about that. And then it progresses to a phase that I originally called deliberation in some conversations since then, including with Bertrand, among others, starting to think about that as more of a development phase. Language is still something that we could be talking about. But that's where different people from different interests and different stakeholder groups come together and talk about the issue. So think about this in the abstract and think about it in the specific, right? You get something complicated like NSA surveillance. Like, we have to come together and talk about it. It is very hard to do that when the intelligence agencies aren't in the room. That's a very good point. But we are getting together and talking about it. We're talking about it here. We'll be talking about it at IGF. We were talking about it at last IGF a lot. So there is something that is happening already in this internet governance ecosystem of deliberation and talking about it. And then there's another phase. At some point, if we don't work out everything that we need to work out with the deliberation, you need to get to decisions. You need to get to something that's a little bit more final, that gets validated through some process, that gets understood and interpreted and accepted by the community as being authoritative and decisive in those hard situations where something needs to happen like that. And there's some examples of that happening in different parts of the internet governance ecosystem, but I think it's helpful to think about situations where maybe we do need more capacity for that, where we don't have it right now. Yes, there are lots of complications that are associated with that. Capture is a very real problem. I spent a large portion of my career working on Washington, D.C. domestic politics, in which capture is a very, very real concern in a whole host of different angles. But at the very least, I think it's helpful to realize that, we're never going to all agree on what the ICCPR means, right? We're never going to get everybody in the world to agree on exactly what all of the human rights elements are. So if you have one specific incident, one country doing one thing, and the rest of the world wanting to stop it, you need to figure out how to get there, right? This is why I'm thinking of a decision or a validation phase as occurring, and maybe as something that needs to be built up a little bit more. And then there's a fourth phase, I think, that backstops a lot of these, which is a dispute resolution phase, right? If you have a decision process that's broken, if it has the wrong people who are making the decision or not enough people, or if it just makes the decision through a bad process, there needs to be a sort of a fallback mechanism that people can turn to and can say, hey, that was broken. And if you don't have that, in my view, you don't have a complete ecosystem. So you could imagine this arc in different ways. You could add different pieces into it, like separating out implementation, taking a norm that has been sort of decided upon by some group and turning it into something that has more practical application, and then enforcing that later on. But I think it's sort of helpful to take a step back from the tough issues and from the challenge of getting all of the people in the room together, as important as those things are, and think about this a little bit more in how do we get from start to finish, and what are the missing steps of this path. So my hope at the end of NETmundial is that we will have had good conversations about surveillance, we'll have had good conversations about human rights, we'll have had good conversations about the IANA transition and managing scarce numbering resources and trying to get everybody together to get towards IPv6 and everything else from the sort of technical architectural side that's part of this conversation. But I also hope that we try to identify some tractable pieces that we can bite off in the short term that we can use to help build a more comprehensive, envisionable, imaginable roadmap for internet governance, where we can actually see that we're getting towards the end of the road. And I'm a little bit worried that we're not there yet.
Very interesting to listen to the different perspectives, and sometimes I feel internet governance is a form of spiral learning. You revisit the same issues, but maybe at a higher level. A lot of what I heard in the past few weeks in discussions on LIST about the fuzziness of the term internet governance, or the diplomatic compromise, the creative ambiguity involved in the term that came out of Tunis creates problems. All this may be true, but we have now 10 years history of discussing it, and when we actually framed the discussion, it was always clear that we are talking about different dimensions. We're talking about the underlying physical and logical infrastructure, and we're talking about the issues related to the use and the abuse of the internet. And 10 years ago, well, as Bill will remember, there was a feeling that there was maybe something missing there, and the answer then was seen as the IGF that could provide that kind of missing link where you could discuss issues that were not discussed anywhere else or linked to other issues. And this has been with us now for 8 years, the IGF, and of course everybody agrees there is room for improvement, but at the same time the question now we are discussing, is there need for new mechanisms, is there need for new institutions? And my organization, sorry, the Internet Society, we hold the view that the existing arrangements are sufficiently dynamic, and we should also not forget that the Internet in terms of institutional arrangements is very young. If you compare to other organizations, intergovernmental organizations, the ITU, for instance, the UN Agency for Telecommunication, is 150 years old, so there's a much longer tradition. And the internet organizations have actually proven very dynamic in adapting, and none of them is the same now as it was 10 years ago. They all have grown, and they have also adapted to the growing internet. And the remarks Alex made that there are now 30% people online, and they are only 30%. You can also look, is the glass half full or half empty? And 10 years ago we celebrated the first billion people online, and now it's the second, and this year I think we're expected to have a third billion completed. So this is an exponential growth that is absolutely tremendous. And of course the growing importance of the internet also makes it quite normal that governments attach more importance to the internet. I think nobody except maybe a few libertarian anarchists would deny that governments have a role to play, but nobody has found actually the right role for governments, and not governments themselves either. But that's why a meeting like this is actually very helpful and very important, and it's good to see that there are many high-level government representatives also from developing countries attending, and that's, I think, thanks to the pulling power of the government of Brazil that has this convening power to attract governments. So, but we don't have the answers yet, and as Chris said, yes, sometimes there is a need to take decisions, but at the same time sometimes it's important to prevent the wrong decisions being taken, and governments tend to have knee-jerk reactions. There is a problem, okay, so let's solve the problem. Social media create social unrest, let's ban social media. And that happened, it did not happen in the end, but even in the United Kingdom, when they had social unrest, there were riots in London, there was one government minister who suggested, oh, why don't we close down social media? Fortunately, there were other ministers who said, so that's a no-go area, but other governments have done precisely that. And there, I think we're far away from having global norms. And interestingly enough, yes, the devil is in the detail, and not just in English, also in other languages. But principles are not that easy either. And looking now at the NETmundial, most comments related actually to the principles and not to the roadmap. The roadmap seems fairly reasonable, and Bill outlined the elements there. The roadmap may not be radical for some who had hoped maybe more a revolutionary approach. We actually like the evolutionary approach the document takes, but principles seem to be tougher nuts to crack. Strangely enough, the principle that attracted most comments was a principle proposed actually by the Internet Society, that is permissionless innovation. For some reason, that created outcry, especially from the private sector, who maybe confused it with a call for not respecting intellectual property rights, which is not at all. I mean, we talk here about the basic tenet of the internet, that any kid in a garage can add an invention to the internet. It's the end-to-end principle, the intelligence at the edges, and the internet was designed that way. And that is a principle we hold very high, and I think Tim Berners-Lee will be a speaker at the opening session, Vint Cerf as well, and without that principle the internet would not be where it is. So, but just to say something which we would have assumed to be fairly universally shared does not seem to be that easily to be accepted by everyone. Then, not surprisingly, the other comments relate to human rights, and that is always highly controversial. I mean, I don't need to recall the very politicized debates in the Human Rights Council. You cannot think that the internet would be outside that kind of political controversy. Here we seem to have a majority of, I would call them human rights idealists, but in the real world then you see the hard fights going around these principles. And the third principle that caused many comments is around net neutrality, and there are big commercial interests around without going into the details. But the way forward, I think here I would say we are on the right path, strengthening existing institutions and arrangements. And are there orphan issues? We hold the view no. Bill mentioned spam. Spam was an issue that came up at WICIT, the World Conference on International Telecom Regulations. We had maybe underestimated because in Western industrialized countries, more or less we can handle the problem, but many developing countries said, no, this is a real problem for us, but they did not know where the solutions are. But there are solutions there, but they're not known by everyone. And there, indeed, the knowledge sharing gap does exist. And if we can work towards filling that gap, and if the NETmundial can make a contribution to that, but let's look which existing, before creating new institutions, which existing institution can best fulfill that function. And we think that the IGF is best placed, but the IGF needs to be strengthened and better equipped to deal with precisely, to assume that function.
If you are new to the issue of internet governance, definitely principles seems to be a more inviting section for you to contribute. If you have a human rights background, if you have a civil society and activism background, principles is a easier entrance in the whole discussion. Definitely the roadmap requires some knowledge on the internet governance ecosystem, if you want to stick with the term ecosystem. So Jeanette was criticizing the term ecosystem in the previous panel, and sometimes I have some trouble with the roadmap term as well. So because the roadmap could lead us to some analogies as the ones we were handling here, and it could lead us to the discussion. With that, I conclude. Back in Bali in the IGF last year, there was this whole discussion that led us to the analogy of the roadmap. If we're talking about roads, and people definitely want to talk about buses, so there was this whole discussion about NETmundial being a bus stop. So of course, and the question is, okay, so is the first stop of the bus, which is the last stop of the bus, who is driving the bus, who wants to be on the bus, how much it costs to be on the bus. So, and then you can go as far as you want on the analogies of roads and buses. So let me open up for questions to our panelists. I think we have a good 30 minutes here to go on.
I have two questions for Markus. The first one is on permissionless innovation. I mean, I'm used to the language of free innovation, so I would like to understand what we gain by talking about permissionless innovation.
That you don't have to ask anybody to give the stamp of approval over the innovation. The open standards philosophy, and that has been adhered to not only by the IETF but also by the IEEE and W3C, is that you can make whatever your contribution is to a new standard, and it's in the end, it's not the central authority that approves. Yes, you go through a process, but if you find approval among your peers, then it gets adopted, goes through the usual process, and in the end, it's the user, it's the market that decides whether the standard that has been developed will actually make it or not. Mark Zuckerberg didn't have to ask anybody to come up with Facebook. Had he had to ask, maybe we would not have Facebook and the World Wide Web the same. Tim Berners-Lee, yes, he had to get approval from his direct superior at CERN, who allowed him to work on this project, but that was within the company. There was somebody who recognized that this person had a vision. It was not quite clear where it would lead, but there was potential there, and he was allowed to do it. That was the World Wide Web. But there was he did not have to go to an intergovernmental body, as it is the case with telecommunication standards. They have to be approved by intergovernmental bodies. But check our website. We have a blog post up on permissionless innovation and what exactly it means. I mean, I could go on here, but I know the basics, but there will be more details. But there is a true meaning to it. And for the engineers, this is really a cornerstone for the internet.
And the second one has to do with the sort of institutional setting we have right now is sufficient and we don't need any change. You surely remember, Markus, that before you joined ISOC and you were still sort of involved in the WSIS process, that ISOC said the same thing when civil society suggested the IGF. I remember Lynn saying, we don't need anything, we have everything, and we are against creating new organizations. So what I would like to know is whether the situation now is substantially different from that one, say, 10 years ago. I hope this is not too mean.
On the IGF, for instance, ISOC certainly has made a U-turn, and they say, no, this is something we actually like. And I may have had some influence there, but I would say it's much deeper than that, and my little contribution to shaping the ISOC position, because the ISOC leadership, and that includes the board, recognized the value of the IGF. Now, it may sound very conservative if you say we don't need any change or status quo, but status quo is actually a very, I would call it almost unfair description of the dynamism of the existing internet institutions, because they have changed, and they have changed a lot. I mean, ICANN now is not ICANN what ICANN was 10 years ago. The IETF maybe has, well, even also the IETF is changing. But I mean, they are older than ICANN, and they're very, shall we say, deeply entrenched in their tradition. But even the IETF, they recognize now the leadership that they don't operate in a vacuum, that there is policy around there. There is a need to reach out to developing countries. They do recognize that it is important maybe also to go with their meetings into the developing world. Next year there will be the first time a meeting in Latin America, in Buenos Aires. In the past they held the meetings where the facilities were convenient, where there was a local group that wanted them, but now they have changed their outlook and go reach out to developing countries because they realize it is important to bring in engineers also from developing countries. So existing institutions are actually dynamic. Now, whether or not we do need anything new, I would not exclude that at the end of the day. Okay, if we come to the conclusion that the IGF is not the right, what's a nice word, Bill had the knowledge sharing, the right place for filling the knowledge sharing gap, so be it. But we think there's still a lot of potential in the IGF to reach a higher phase.
I think part of my presentation I spoke about candidness in the issues that we are going to discuss. So I think I should start by demonstrating the same. And here I would like to say one thing, that I think we must come into this not with a baggage that since ICANN exists, that it must be ICANN. I think the disruptiveness I was saying, we must actually start asking what do we want with the internet governance. Then we look at the institutions, the processes and the requirements we need. Then we look at what we have. But if we start that we have ICANN, so we don't have another entity, we have already started from a defensive position. It becomes a tough war. It's probably push and pull, IGF or the other one, but we can actually start asking what are our needs, then what do we have? And I think part of the arguments we all know that have been used in the past to question whether ICANN, even if it IANA contract was relinquished to it, is really ICANN, and stated on his website, is a Californian institution that follows Californian law and the laws of the US. Now, there are certain countries, in fact, quite a number of countries that are concerned by that mere fact, that this is an American institution, which is obviously known, so it must follow American law. So we must then question to what extent or where do we put limitations and what guarantees are there if it must continue being ICANN. So I would rather, from my point of view, start from that point of view, what are our needs, then build backwards and start seeing whether maybe they are all going to be addressed adequately given the current institutions or what is needed. And then on the document, I think there was a word that was there, democracy. It was deleted. And some of the civil society organizations are extremely concerned why, if it's a principle, why democracy would be deleted from a document that was there. And there is also concern with the mention of the word multi-stakeholderism. If you count the number of times that word is mentioned, you can count the document, yet it is not defined what that multi-stakeholderism is. When you talk of multi-stakeholders, they may sound the same, stakeholders and stakeholders, but sometimes actually the people holding the stake that are there, stakeholders, and then there, of course, is the one S-T-A-K-E and S-T-A-K. So we don't confuse the two words when people are talking of multi-stakeholders, but they're indeed talking about the people who are holding the stake of the ICANN, the fat part of it, of the internet. So I think we need to have these terms clearly define what they stand so that we have a uniform understanding.
The term that was removed is not democracy, it's democratic. And there's an ongoing debate since the WSIS, because everybody loads the different words with a lot of background meaning. And so it is true that the reason why the actors want the term democratic there is because it is another way to say the involvement of governments and the intergovernmental processes. And the reason why there is a reaction on the other side is because there are assumptions of intentions of pushing one thing, which means that now there's a polarized debate that was illustrated in many meetings between an absolute intergovernmental approach versus an absolute multi-stakeholder approach that would be so completely private sector without the governments and so on. I hope we will be able to move beyond that. If the price to pay is to repeat the wording of the WSIS by saying multi-stakeholder and democratic, and we actually go in the roadmap into what it means on a case-by-case basis to define mechanisms that allow the different stakeholders to work together, it's fine. But staying at the level of fighting whether the word democratic should be there or not, there was a discussion in the previous panel, as you know, on whether multi-stakeholderism, whatever the ism is an enhancement of democracy or what. It's a very useful discussion, actually, because it puts a burden of caring about the representation of people, the inclusion and so on, instead of discussing whether the monopoly of representation is just the governments. But this is what we've been discussing for 10 years, and I think it is necessary to move one step further. Just one question to Marcus following the exchange with Jeanette. If I understand correctly, the position is that basically there is enough potential in the IGF to do all the things that Bill was mentioning, i.e. creating working groups, having processes intersessionally, etc. I think it's a very good evolution for all of us to think about this evolution. That being said, what should be done if there is no agreement to move in that direction? Because honestly, this is a debate that has been pushed by a lot of people for the last 10 years. Do we really believe that it will move? Or I know that a certain number of people who are talking about additional mechanisms and so on are actually thinking about things that are closely attached to the IGF, and there were jokes and play with words talking about an IGTF, something that would be a Internet Governance Task Force, the equivalent of what the IESG is doing, saying, okay, let basically the MAG continue to be the program committee for the annual event, and maybe there's another process that deals with the creation of working groups, but that is closely attached to the IGF. Is that part of the landscape, or what do we do if there is no agreement to move forward on the IGF? Can we have permissionless policy making so that we can build things to solve issues instead of being blocked by a few governments or a few companies or a few whatever who don't want the thing to evolve?
Two quick questions. One is a very naive one. Do you see this improved IGF as suggested in the NETmundial document as a venue in which those phases or this framework could be inserted on? And what are the challenges that you see on those stages?
The short answer is, I think, yes. I do see the IGF as being the lion's share, or potentially, if expanded and built out in the right way with the right kinds of working groups and things, being able to encapsulate or spin off and seed all of these things. The tricky one is dispute resolution, I think, and in making sure that that gets done in an inclusive way. That's the biggest nut to crack, and I don't know exactly how to imagine doing that. So I think Aaron's surveillance example is actually the best one for me in sort of thinking about this, right? So a different outside the IGF context, Turkey censors social media. What happens? It goes up to the European Court of Rights, who goes back and says, hey, stop that. U.S. government surveillance creates a lot of victims around the world. There's not really a place for them to go to. I'm not saying for sure that there should be, but I'm saying that there is a perceived gap there. And that's the sort of thing that I wonder if it's possible for some body of IGF to at least normatively come to a decision or normatively mediate some sort of dispute like that. I do think I could see this all coming out of that, but I think that's the thing that I'm going to be thinking about a lot over the next couple of days, is how would you deal with a scenario like that? Not to a law outcome, I'm not pushing for that, but even any sort of inclusive, like letting everybody become part of the conversation, come to a normative, right feeling outcome about a tough question like that. That's going to be what I'm going to be thinking about.
I think Chris's comments are particularly apt, so I'll adopt them. And this idea of dispute resolution, I think that is one of the critical elements. And in order to have a dispute resolved, you need a legitimate source of authority to resolve that dispute, especially if you want to do it in a binding way. We have courts to do that. This is not that. The IGF would not have any binding authority. This is not going to happen, and not in the foreseeable future. So it'd be non-binding and it would be normative. But you need to have a place to air those disputes, because there's a lot of tension building up around these issues. And this kind of goes back to the point that I was making. In some ways, there's no good place to vent that tension. So the IGF is a perfect format. I mean, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Everybody who cares shows up once a year at the IGF, so that's a perfect place to do it. And noting that you're not going to have any binding resolutions that'll come out of it, but that doesn't mean that there's no normative force behind any disputes that are resolved in that fashion.
I have advocated that the IGF performing the kinds of functions that I talked about with regard to knowledge sharing and helping policymakers to develop policy networks to address their problems since a decade. But that was very much resisted by the Internet Society, the business community, and various other players who said, no, this could lead to dancing. This could lead to, bad things. We don't know. This is problematic. And so the problem is then the issue has languished. And meanwhile, we have repeatedly, for 10 years, had developing country governments say whether ISOC thinks there's orphan issues or not, and whether the working group on enhanced cooperation is able to identify them or not. We've repeatedly had governments say, I want to deal with a problem of X. I don't see that there is a clear, identifiable, bounded institutional framework for me to take this up in. I don't know how to begin to address it. I want to know what's out there. I want some mapping. I want some identification of possible models to follow, people to connect with, resources, expertise, possible solutions. We have not done anything to really fill that gap enough, in my view. And so then the question becomes, well, can it be layered into the IGF now? I would like that. There are constraints, though. Dealing with the United Nations body that's under the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, bureaucratically raises some issues. And there are people who think maybe if it was an independent entity with multi-stakeholder support that could be linked to the IGF, cooperate with the IGF, but not be bound by the same set of restrictions, this might be better. It's a debate worth having. That's my point. I just want to start to have this in a more focused way rather than letting the issue languish.
We ask ourselves what ICANN is. We all know what ICANN says is it's an institution for technical coordination and works to ensure the security and resiliency of the internet. And therefore then we know the other things are outside of ICANN's mission. And that's a bit starting point. We also then recognize that over time, ICANN has been extending its own mandate to other areas that are non-traditional or those key focus areas. What are some of the examples? ICANN has become a global trademarks rights enforcement institution. It is increasingly creating trademark rights in terms of the domain name. There was initially an RFC that by John Postel when ICANN was not meant to bother with the trademarks or other rights, but now there was a resolution, and I think even on the new GTLD, the working group, there was somewhere where even they are supposed to be clearing houses. So we find it extending that. Now it got onto the front of the content with the .xxx issue, and we all know how the debate went and settled, but I think we are progressively seeing ICANN trying maybe to get out or try to do a bit more to address the gaps, but it starts with understanding what the mission of the organization is. Then we can ask ourselves whether the suppressed issues like the ones Bill is talking about for the last 10 years, whether they have a home. And I think calling them orphan is actually a bad way. It's really, it's the narratives. You know, everything is in the perception. The moment you start by describing an issue as an orphan, you have actually just, you have started on the wrong footing, because you have already dismissed it. And I think we need to be careful. Now, Bill will also tell you about some of the shortcomings developing countries have had with ICANN. Very challenging, including a lot of governments from developing countries. There were certain initiatives, for example, which was started in Nairobi, ICANN meeting, 37th meeting, which was meant to address some of these inequities in terms of ownership of cyberspace, if you want to call them assets, like domain registrations, you know, registries, how African developing countries could have, because it turned out, if you just check, they are all owned and operated from maybe America and some few European countries. So you find African countries don't have any. So a working group called JAS was started, and the intent was to probably subsidize and find a way of equitable, making sure that at least some of the developing countries, not just Africa, had access under the new program, rather than having to pay $180,000 to be registered. It was saddening that despite all that effort, it never bore any fruit in Africa. There was not a single one that applied, even under the community. Actually, under JAS. Under JAS, none. So you find volunteers can spend a lot of time trying to do that, but at the end of the day, the whole idea, for whatever reasons within the system, it doesn't fulfill the requirements or the needs of those countries. So these are some of the challenges, and I'm sure there are many others. I don't want to narrate all of them, but I'm just trying to show that given the mission or the definition of the entity, the many challenges that are there, we need probably to have that list of what are the issues, and therefore then we can actually look for a home and how to solve them. And if ICANN, if IGF, if any other entity can do it, fair enough. And again, on the dispute, we have to again start questioning all these disputes that have to do with the domain names and how WIPO is treating them, because there has been concerns that I think commercial interests always seem to win these disputes. So we need to look at even these the resolution processes and mechanisms that are there, and take stock of the history of how they have been going and whether they have been fair, and maybe under what, when there's the international disputes, which law actually pertains. Because if you again put them into one place and forget about the problem, we are not solving it, but I think we are throwing it into, we are wishing away the problem, and we might as well confront it and seek a solution.
Sometimes ideas come too early to be realized. And I think for the IGF, had you been too ambitious to begin with, you may have driven out some key actors. And it was important to gain confidence, and as several speakers said now, people feel comfortable going to the IGF. And I think in Bali it was significant that the US government actually came with a big delegation there and to face the community. They realized they would be in a bad spot about the NSA disclosures, but they chose to face the community head on, and they chose the IGF for that. So I would say it had proved its relevance, and had it not tackled that issue, then I would agree it would not be relevant any longer. But okay, it has moved on, and I think time is ripe now to take the extra step. I think most actors realize the internet is not the same as it was when the idea came up, and there are issues that need to be addressed. And I very much agree with Alex on the orphan, that we don't want to dismiss the issues. And I think 2 years ago I didn't know there was such a thing as a messaging anti-abuse working group, but this working group deals with spam. But not everybody knows about it. So, our job is to make it known and to make sure the people know where to go. And we have actually done quite a bit of that, holding workshops on spam in Latin America, in Africa, because we realized there is a need for that. So, and yes, there will also be limits to what the IGF can do. And I think dispute resolution, for instance, may well be one of the limits that may be outside the remit, but the IGF can always prepare the ground, and to have the dialogue, I think, is important also on controversial issues, and the solutions may then be found in another forum.
we would like just to do as a quick wrap up to say thanks to everyone who was involved in the organization of this seminar. But before thanking everyone who was involved, we would like to say thank you especially to the ones who have supported this event, and that is the CIGI-BR, the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and the Canadian IDRC, who without their support we could not even put an event such as this one, with a very engaging and interesting discussion that we had in the morning in a closed session, doing this Brazilian and German gathering, and then in the afternoon having this high-level panel and advancing the discussion on principles and on the roadmap.
For me, it's just to say thanks again to the sponsors, and thank you most of all to ITS Rio for putting this on in the alien city that you've come to put this on. It was great fun. You conquered the city. It was a very constructive discussion in the morning on German-Brazilian initiatives, and we, I think, successfully globalized it this afternoon. It has been a great cooperation, and thanks to everybody on your staff and team. Has been a really fruitful cooperation, and thanks to everybody who was with us during the day. We hope this is not a one-off, and the debate and the issues will certainly be with us, and there'll be lots to discuss and work together on in the future. So thank you all, and have a good NETmundial and a good stay here in Brazil, and have a good night.
Thanks very much on behalf of the Network of Centers, the organizers of this marvelous event. I learned a lot, I must say, in these sessions we had today. Thanks to the sponsors as well. It was great that you made this possible. I've been sent a newspaper piece during the conference on NETmundial that was published yesterday, I think, in Germany, and there it says multi-stakeholderism is complex, time-consuming and confusing. But later on it says it's the only adequate and sustainable way to deal with internet governance. So I think we had a really great time here, and we are all still confused, I guess, but on a much higher level than before, and that's excellent for a conference outcome. And Vince Cerf said that scaling is really an important thing, and so tomorrow we will gather again or show up again with 800 other people and see what we can do. It was a great preparation for that, and thank you again.
I'm just saying thank you to the researchers and the staff of ITS that end up putting this together. So we have a bunch of people from the ITS in the room. So we have Fabro, who was running around and making sure that everything was on top for you guys during this day. And Griso, Aleixo, Max, Ju, Constance. Esqueci alguém? No. So thanks everyone for putting this together. It was great to have this experience here.